Welcome to all our online viewers to Global Taiwan Institute's first ever webinar. My name is Russell Hsiao. I am the Executive Director of GTI. GTI is a 501c3 think tank based in Washington, D.C., dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about issues relevant to Taiwan policy. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a bi-weekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, featuring timely analysis as well as informed opinions about Taiwan, public seminars on policy-relevant issues related to Taiwan, an annual symposium held in Washington, D.C. every September, where we invite leading policymakers and thinkers to discuss Taiwan policy, and also research fellowship opportunities that help support researchers who want to conduct short-term field research in Taiwan, and also for researchers from Taiwan to conduct short-term field research here in Washington, D.C. If you are not already subscribed to receive all our publications and program updates, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. Before we begin today's seminar, viewers should note that we will leave around 15 minutes at the end of the discussion to take questions. Viewers may ask questions by using the chat function on YouTube or by sending an email to contact@globaltaiwan.org. Make sure to include your name and affiliation in your message. I'll repeat these instructions again later in the event. Also, I'd be remiss if I did not take this opportunity to thank GTI's co-founders, our board of directors, our advisors, staff, and supporters who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's seminar on COVID-19 and Taiwan's role in global governance. Amid the novel coronavirus global pandemic, medically known as COVID-19, Taiwan's response has been applauded by many international community for its effectiveness and because of the island's proximity to the People's Republic of China. While some officials and commentators have glorified the China model for Beijing's response to the pandemic, others, including the United States, have held up the Taiwan model for the democracy's successful efforts to contain the pandemic that originated across the strait. As COVID-19 upended communities around the globe, the health and economic fallout from the pandemic has also exposed weaknesses in global governance systems. One glaring gap laid bare by the current crisis has been Taiwan's exclusion from the World Health Body, designed to lead global health response. In turn, this has highlighted how cross-strait relations and Taiwan's exclusion from international bodies can have international repercussions beyond the possibility of military conflict. GTI organized this virtual seminar today to discuss how the United States and Taiwan are cooperating to combat COVID-19, the Taiwan model versus the China model, and the implications of the pandemic for global governance. We are very fortunate to bring to our audience a truly fantastic group of speakers. First, we are truly delighted to be able to feature Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister, Xu Ziqian, also Dr. Lang-Hee Chen of the Hoover Institute, Vincent Chow, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office, and Mike Mazza, who, besides being a non-resident fellow, senior fellow at GTI, holds positions at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, and German Marshall Fund. First, for our opening speaker, we'll hear a brief message from Dr. Xu Ziqian. In addition to being Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Minister, he is especially well suited to speak on the topic of our discussion today, since he previously served as the president of the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, which supports deepening of democracy both within Taiwan and around the world. So at this point, I'll ask our speakers to please turn off their audio as well as their video as we play the pre-recorded message from the Deputy Foreign Minister.
Deputy Assistant Secretary Johnson Fritz, Executive Director Russell Hsiao, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to thank the Global Taiwan Institute for hosting this timely and meaningful webinar. Though I cannot be there in person, I'm glad to have this opportunity to say a few words about Taiwan's role in the global governance, and in particular, how Taiwan can help and is helping to stop the COVID-19 outbreaks. Owing to the lack of transparency within China at the very onset of the virus, COVID-19 has rapidly spread across the globe. Under these circumstances, almost no country has remained unaffected. Fortunately, since we learned the lesson in a hard way during the 2003 SARS outbreak, this time around, Taiwan has adopted a series of responses to effectively contain the COVID-19 outbreak. The major actions we have taken include advanced preparations and early response, openness and transparency in terms of information sharing, public-private partnership, and technology solutions. I'm sure my technical colleague will share more details about the Taiwan model during the panel discussion later. Taiwan's acute observations and swift responses from the beginning, including its dedication of national resources to building new production lines for medical supplies, paved the way for efforts to be directed later toward providing international humanitarian assistance. On March 18th, Taiwan and the US issued a joint statement on a partnership against coronavirus, facilitating cooperation in research and development of rapid tests, as well as research and production of vaccines and medicine. On April 1st, President Tsai announced a donation of 10 million medical masks to the United States, EU member states, and diplomatic allies for distribution to their frontline medical personnel. A second round of donations totaling 7 million masks were shipped to Japan, new southbound policy partner countries, and other severely impacted countries. Taiwan is also working with the medical research centers in other countries to develop rapid test kits and vaccines. All of these efforts demonstrate that Taiwan can help and Taiwan is helping. On the contrary, in the midst of COVID-19 outbreaks, the Chinese Communist regime has launched a large-scale global propaganda campaign to sell a narrative that authoritarian regimes are superior and more effective than democratic countries in managing crisis. However, the Taiwan model has proved that transparency and accountability help build stronger trust between the government and its people. And this trust leads to public participation by the vibrant civil society with joint efforts to counter the outbreak. This model of governance is worth sharing and is undoubtedly a better path for democratic countries in dealing with the outbreak. The COVID-19 pandemic has once again showcased the urgent need to include Taiwan in the global pandemic response system, such as the World Health Organization. While diplomatic allies and more like-minded countries have supported Taiwan's participation in the WHO, Beijing continues to maintain strong political opposition. Yet, as we know, infectious diseases know no borders, and politics should not override human rights and the health of people worldwide. In this era of globalization, Taiwan should not have a fight solitary battle, nor should the WHO ignore any country's contributions to global health and safety. Here, I wish to express my heartfelt gratitude to the US administration and Congress for its bipartisan support for Taiwan's participation in the WHO, as well as their efforts in expanding Taiwan's international space over the years. Taiwan has always been a proactive and responsible member of the international community, especially in the area of public health. We will be happy to share our advanced medical and healthcare technologies, experiences, and best practices with the global community to overcome challenges to public health. As part of these efforts, yesterday I participated in the GCTF online workshop on combating disinformation on COVID-19. Given the importance of being able to have timely and accurate information at a time like this, other workshops are being planned for the next few months where Taiwan can share its best practices in disease prevention with the international community. In closing, let me emphasize that Taiwan is always willing and able to serve as a partner in protecting global public health, whether it's in the region or around the world. Efforts to combat the spread of communicable diseases or any emerging global challenges require nations worldwide to share their successful experiences and work together. Taiwan will continue to work with US, our diplomatic allies, and like-minded countries to safeguard the health and well-being of the international community. Thank you again, and I hope you have a fruitful discussion ahead.
Hi, Russell. I think you're still muted right now.
Thank you. And I want to mute our colleagues here. Okay, I think we're all good now. Excellent. On behalf of the Global Taiwan Institute, I want to thank Deputy Minister Xu for those excellent remarks. I think it really underscores the importance of the topic of our discussion today on COVID-19 and Taiwan's role in global governance. And now we'd like to move into our expert panel discussion. Allow me to quickly introduce our panelists, who will each open with some comments, and we'll have a moderated discussion afterwards. First of all, I should note that unfortunately, due to some scheduling difficulties, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Jonathan Fritz, is unable to join. But at the same time, we have a superb lineup of speakers to include Dr. Lang-Hee Chen, who is the David and Diane Steffi Fellow in American Public Policy Studies at the Hoover Institution, and Director of Domestic Policy Studies and lecturer in the Public Policy Program at Stanford University. We also have Vincent Chow, who is the Director of the Political Division at the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States. And Michael Mazza, who in addition to being a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute, is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a non-resident fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. As a reminder, we will leave around 15 minutes at the end of the discussion to take questions. Viewers may ask questions by using the chat function on YouTube or by sending an email to contact@globaltaiwan.org. Please make sure to include your name and affiliation in your message. First, I'd like to invite Vincent to talk about Taiwan's contribution to global health governance. Vincent, over to you.
Thanks, Russell. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for holding this event. I missed seeing all of you in person. I'll be brief because I think Deputy Minister Xu has already covered much of Taiwan's response, but I want to throw a few ideas out there for discussion. The first question is related to directly to Russell's topic, which is whether Taiwan has the capacity to contribute to global health. So let's first go over whether Taiwan has the capacity and then explore ways it can contribute. So as Deputy Minister Xu and many others have spoken out about, I think that's a pretty strong yes in terms of Taiwan's capacity to contribute. I was flipping through the Johns Hopkins map last night and we're way down in weeds. So we've had 429 cases That's slightly less than Malta. 75% of those cases have already recovered. So most people have undoubtedly heard reports about how Taiwan has accomplished this. Actions we've taken, including testing, stockpiling, a clear sense of leadership, mix of digital technology, and of course, really at the heart of it, a strong sense of foreboding right from the start, given our experiences with SARS and with China in general. So a lot of these experiences that we've had do have the capacity to be shared. And I think this Taiwan model, as we're calling it, can be beneficial to democracies around the world, particularly as an alternative to what authoritarian countries like China have been pushing. So that's the first question. The second question is, what can we share and how we're doing it? So the first thing we can share is experience. And at TechRow, we've pretty much made it a priority to work with as many people here as we can to get the Taiwan model out there through discussions, panels, seminars, and editorials. And this is what's happening also in other places around the world. So Audrey Tang at this point, I think, could be mistaken for a member of the coronavirus task force, given the amount of time she's appeared in the media and think tank events. And I hope she'll make it on Saturday Night Live soon. So just yesterday, Deputy Minister Xu, along with the State Department's Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, as well as AIT Director Brent Christensen, they held a GCTF workshop actually to highlight the importance of transparency and government accountability as we combat disinformation. And as we know, in pandemics such as this, disinformation has about as much potential to do damage as the virus itself. So further to this, last month, Taiwan and the US released a joint statement pledging cooperation in a number of areas, from the development of medicines to the sharing of best practices and the engagement of medical exchanges. So these issues were also covered during a phone call that was made between our health ministers this Monday. So this is a lot of work we're doing with the United States, but it's also not just with the US. We're also engaged with our European friends and partners, exemplified by this joint statement that was signed between Taiwan and the Czech Republic earlier this month, also on cooperation against the coronavirus. So our doctors and experts are also having these robust discussions with their counterparts in the Indo-Pacific region, and we're sharing best practices with our diplomatic allies, some of which are really especially vulnerable and at risk due to the coronavirus. So all of this is happening on the experience sharing front. We're also doing a lot in helping provide resources in the fight against the coronavirus. So I think all of us know that we've donated a lot of millions of masks to countries around the world, including 3.5 million here to the States. And I expect we'll see much, much more of this, especially as people in Taiwan now can choose to donate their weekly allotment of masks right on their smartphone. So they can click, I want to donate, what I'm getting every week abroad. The lesser reported story is that while these medical supplies, they've made a big impact here in the United States, Europe, and other places, they're actually having an even bigger impact in our diplomatic allies, which in the past have been underserved by the WHO and other global health bodies. And some of these countries, which are smaller and have fewer medical resources to spare, are at particular risk from this. So let me give some examples. In Eswatini, for example, we're not only donating masks, we're also donating surgical gowns, gloves. We've provided financial grants and other resources to make sure that their population is well insulated and prepared. In Belize, we've donated $1 million to support the purchasing of testing kits and other critical supplies. In St. Kitts, we've donated thermal detectors and thermometers to protect public spaces. So the list goes on and on and on. And this is in addition to the medical teams that we have in many of these countries, as well as the numerous medical exchanges we're currently engaged in with their doctors and their medical professionals. So all of this brings me to my third and final part, which is what more can we do? And as I've discussed, there's a lot Taiwan is doing, but much of this has taken place on a bilateral or regional basis. The missing jigsaw piece really is Taiwan's participation in the WHO and the potential for our health experts and our medical doctors to support the WHO and support their fight against COVID-19, particularly in some of these lesser served countries around the world. So I had an exchange with some officials from the WHO a few days ago on this issue. And I think they're pretty adamant in terms of how they see the issue of Taiwan's participation. But as all of us know, and I think as Lan He has spoken about this at length, the only country that has a vested interest in preventing Taiwan's participation is China. And for the WHO to base their decision off essentially China's interests is quite disappointing, to say the least. So I think the important part is there is probably a way out of this. And observership is very important to the people of Taiwan to ensure that our 23 million people are effectively represented at the body. And we'll continue to push for that together with like-minded countries such as the United States. But at the same time, I think that what we can begin and continue to strengthen our work on with the WHO is to include more of our experts really at this point in technical discussions, to leverage more of our assets in underserved countries around the world, such as our diplomatic allies, and to provide a better platform for us to engage in experience sharing, particularly from our doctors and our medical professionals. So all of this can help further build momentum and forge further consensus on Taiwan that we do have a capacity to support global health. So none of this will be easy, but we hope the WHO can display real leadership during these difficult times, because leadership, I think, is exactly what countries are expecting of them at this point, especially countries that provide hundreds of millions of dollars every year in contributions. So let me end with a quote I read on the Marshall Islands Journal a few days ago. The quote said, it's long past time for countries of the world to recognize Taiwan as a member of the WHO. Why wouldn't we want one of the world's best players on the team? And I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent, for that very comprehensive, I think, overview of how Taiwan is helping and contributing to global health. What I'd like you to do at the end of everyone's remarks is to think about how in other ways Taiwan is helping in terms of the global governance systems and in other sort of forums in which Taiwan is excluded. Obviously, the World Health Body, the World Health Organization is the primary focus of our discussion today, but given that the scope of our discussion today is it's larger than just health issues, perhaps there are, you could think about other forums in which Taiwan's participation could benefit the international community. And next, I'd like to move over to Lan He, who will provide us with a U.S. perspective on WHO governance and Taiwan's role in it. Lan He, over to you.
Well, thank you, Russell. Thank you to GTI for sponsoring and hosting this event and for this conversation, which I think is about a very important topic. What I want to do is provide some context and perspective on the World Health Organization, and in particular, some of what we've seen from the World Health Organization in its response to this novel coronavirus. And obviously, the perspective that I'm providing is from the U.S. perspective. Some of the challenges I think we've seen with the World Health Organization have been well documented. I want to situate the conversation, first of all, in a little bit of history. Then I want to talk about the current response and some of the challenges in particular with respect to how the World Health Organization's exclusion of Taiwan reflects a broader prioritization of politics over public health from a global institution, which really should be focused on helping to heal the sick and to alleviate suffering and pain, as opposed to advancing political agendas. I think, unfortunately, the WHO has fallen into the trap that a lot of multinational organizations have fallen into in recent years, which is to prioritize politics over whatever the greater mission of that organization is. So historically, I think it's important to begin by noting the degree to which the WHO has played an important role in addressing some of humankind's greatest health challenges. It's certainly the case. The WHO has done heroic work in eradicating diseases that once were scourges. Consider, for example, its role in fighting smallpox, its continuing role in fighting polio, and its role on the front lines in the early 2000s of the SARS epidemic. And there, I think our story begins, because when the WHO was dealing with the SARS epidemic, it dealt with it in a very critical and very aggressive way, in a way that was designed to press China in particular, where the outbreak largely began, to press China in particular on its disclosure of what was going on, its information it was providing to the global community. And at the time, the WHO actually came under some fire for the aggressive way in which it sought to get information from China in particular, information that had been covered up, and that, if disclosed earlier, probably could have saved lives and could have improved health outcomes in a number of East Asian societies in particular. If you fast forward the 2 decades since the SARS epidemic, what you find is a trail littered with poor responses. The WHO was frankly asleep at the switch during the Ebola crisis that struck West Africa in 2004. It was accused of a over-response to a flu pandemic that struck in 2009, 2010, and of course, challenges around the current response to novel coronavirus. And you might ask, well, what's the difference between the WHO of then and the WHO of now? And I'd argue 2 things. First of all, leadership. The leadership of the organization has changed several times. It changed from the time of SARS, when the former Prime Minister of Norway was the executive director, the individual in charge of the WHO, through to a woman named Margaret Chan, who had been the Minister of Health in Hong Kong. She was criticized by many for an overly bureaucratic and slow response, as I mentioned earlier, to the Ebola virus. To today, when we're seeing leadership in the form of a gentleman named Dr. Tedros, who many of you are familiar with. He goes by his first name, Tedros. Dr. Tedros' response to this crisis in particular has been the source of significant criticism, and I think highlights the degree to which the WHO has prioritized a desire to placate member countries. And in this case in particular, its desire to placate and please the People's Republic of China, instead of really thinking carefully about its role as a global public health agency. Now, we can talk at length later on about some of the reforms that are needed at WHO, and surely there are a series of reforms that are needed. But I think that the current leadership in the WHO has made prioritization of public health, has actually deprioritized, public health in the context of its reaction and its response to the coronavirus. And I think that has been quite apparent, in particular in its continuing desire to exclude Taiwan. And so I would say that this is a prime example of the way in which the WHO has continued to press the political agenda of the PRC over the global improvement of public health. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, the WHO has been exceedingly kind and exceedingly deferential toward the PRC in its disclosure of information related to the novel coronavirus. So if you go back in the timeline, and many of you may be familiar with this, the initial surfacing of symptoms in the Hubei province near Wuhan began in early December. Yet for several weeks, the WHO did not seek to gather information from sources on the ground, did not seek out the role of global nonprofits who may have assisted in a surveillance effort to determine what was happening there, did not in fact really get its act together until January, and even then was slow to the punch. It was slow to the punch in particular when it ignored a warning from the Ministry of Health in Taiwan in late December regarding the possibility that the novel coronavirus, now known as COVID-19, could be transmitted from human to human. As late as mid-January, the WHO continued its false assertions that the virus could not be transmitted between humans, and in fact did not send a delegation of the organization to investigate on the ground in China until mid-February, until the virus had spread to many other countries around the world and had likely infected tens of thousands by that time. So the WHO's slowness to respond, the degree to which it was intent on placating China, suggests that the organization itself is in fundamental need of reform. And again, it starts at the top. Dr. Tedros, the man who runs the WHO now, has been, again, very complimentary of China's response. And it is the case, surely, that China has shared information with the WHO. It's also shared only that information with the WHO which it wants the world to see. And so the failure of the WHO to more critically examine, to more critically look at this information, the fact that it waited, in fact, until mid-March to declare a global pandemic, suggests that the WHO is badly in need of reform. And I'll just conclude by saying that there are a number of different ideas that scholars and analysts have suggested for reform of the WHO, some of which extend to a need for greater transparency, some of which extend to a need for greater accountability, some of which extend to the degree to which the organization is too much dependent on the whims of its member countries. But I will say that one of the ways in which the WHO has been most negligent is in its failure to acknowledge the role that Taiwan can play in helping to provide public health information, in helping to provide information regarding ways to effectively combat the pandemic. And by the way, this is not new. Taiwan has been excluded from participation in the World Health Assembly since 2016. It has been repeatedly denied greater cooperation in the more technical committees that actually govern the work of the World Health Organization. And so the question becomes, why is the World Health Organization so intent on keeping out a resource that could help the rest of the world? And the answer again returns to its concern for politics, its concern for Beijing's response, and its concern for the prioritization again of political factors over public health factors. And that is something that the United States is right to be looking at, is right to be pressing on. The Trump administration has been quite aggressive, as many of you will know, in this regard. And while, of course, the WHO is not solely to blame for the challenges created by the novel coronavirus, to ignore the role and the factor that it has been in allowing the coronavirus to spread as widely and as significantly as it has is something that is up for investigation and ought to be pressed by authorities, not just here in the US, but around the world. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and look forward to addressing questions as we move ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Lanky, for that, I think, very compelling argument. And I think it really shows how China figures instrumentally and materially in some of the many deficiencies that you've highlighted. And I think one of the point that you made with regards to Taiwan's exclusion from technical meetings reminded me of actually another event that Vincent had actually participated in which he gave some very detailed information with regards to just how many of these technical meetings Taiwan has been prevented from participating in. And I think and when we do get to the audience Q&A and discussion, I would like Vincent just to return to that also and to really provide some more details to our audience. And also, Langy, I think maybe just to build off of what you had said, and just to give you some time to think about this question, is that, of course, again, the discussion here today is about global governance, and health is, of course, one of the key focus of our discussion today. But governance, global governance of international institutions extends well beyond just health issues. This includes civil aviation, law enforcement, just to name a couple. For instance, I think it's quite remarkable and unbelievable, really, that the PRC was earlier this month appointed to a seat on the United Nations Human Rights Council panel, where essentially it will play a key role in picking the world's body's human rights investigators. So I'd like you, to think about this and speak to the larger issue of global governance and what you think the Trump administration should do about it, or is doing about it. And next, and since we have already talked about, since as Lanky had mentioned with regards to the issue of China, I'd like to move over now to my colleague, Mike Mazza, who will then discuss China's response to COVID-19 and also how cost and the impact on cross-strait relations. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Russell, and thanks for having me here today and putting on this event. Look, I think the bottom line up front here is that I think cross-strait ties may be in a dangerous place right now, or entering a dangerous place. I think Taiwan and its allies and partners should be prepared for the possibility that Beijing will turn even more assertive than it's been, perhaps even aggressive vis-a-vis Taiwan in the coming months. But before looking forward, I want to take a quick look in the rearview mirror. I think China could have seen COVID-19 as an opportunity to try to stabilize ties with Taiwan, perhaps to attempt to win over some hearts and minds there. Beijing could have moved quickly to share information with Taiwan's government and to invite Taiwanese health officials or independent experts to stay and monitor the situation in Wuhan. Beijing could have worked closely with the authorities in Taiwan to evacuate Taiwanese citizens from Wuhan in a responsible way. Beijing could have cleared the path, even if only temporarily, for Taiwan's practical participation in the WHO and the International Civil Aviation Organization. Beijing could have paused its years-long pressure campaign on Taiwan and prioritized, again, perhaps only temporarily, global public health over politics. But as we know, China did none of those things. From the early days of this pandemic, China has acted irresponsibly. The Chinese Communist Party has consistently prioritized narrow parochial interests over the welfare of the Chinese people, not to mention the welfare of anyone else. And in the particular case of Taiwan, Beijing made clear early on in the crisis that its priorities would be continuing to ensure Taiwan's isolation on the international stage and sustaining a high level of military pressure on Taiwan, arguably higher than in the weeks and months preceding the outbreak. And so instead of a Chinese policy that aimed to avert the spread of the novel coronavirus to Taiwan and to support the Tsai administration's efforts to ensure the health and safety of Taiwan citizens at home and abroad, we got a Chinese policy which arguably had precisely the opposite effect. Taipei continued to face restrictions on its engagement with the WHO, as we heard. The Chinese government played games with Taiwan's efforts to repatriate citizens in Wuhan. And the People's Liberation Army has conducted military exercises with the clear aim of demonstrating its advancing capabilities and intimidating Taiwan. So earlier this year, we saw Beijing opt for an uncompromising, perhaps a go-hard approach vis-a-vis Taiwan. And then Taiwan went and did something to really provoke Beijing. It managed an exemplary response to COVID-19. And then other countries began to take notice. And then Taiwan began donating, not selling, donating millions and millions of masks and other medical equipment all around the world, as Vincent described. Can you imagine the gall? I'm being sarcastic, of course. And to my knowledge, none of these supplies have proven defective. None of them have actually impaired the efforts of other countries to counter COVID-19 as faulty Chinese tests may have done. And so this is the first reason that I'm concerned about cross-strait relations in the coming months. China is fighting tooth and nail to save its severely tarnished reputation. Deputy Foreign Minister Xu talked about the global propaganda effort it's waging, and I think that's a fight that China is losing at the moment. Meanwhile, Taiwan may come out of this crisis smelling like roses. Foreign observers can't help but draw comparisons, and those are unfavorable comparisons from Beijing's perspective. I think foreign observers can't help but conclude that Taiwan must have valuable knowledge and experience to share. Foreign observers can't help but conclude that maybe current circumstances would be better, even if only marginally, if Taiwan was not excluded from the WHO and the broader international community. And I think foreign observers can't help but notice that Taiwan has been eager and willing to help, indeed, its friends in need. And all of a sudden, Beijing must be worrying about a coming sea change in the world's approach to Taiwan, especially in Europe. China's response may well be more pressure and more intimidation, both of Taiwan and of perhaps some of Taiwan's newfound friends. But for me, an even bigger concern is that we may be entering a period where Chinese actual use of force against Taiwan is more likely than it has been in some time. As has been clear prior to this pandemic, Xi Jinping is intent on unification. He's been clear in describing unification as a key aspect of his promised great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And he has, as we have seen, evinced little flexibility in his approach to cross-strait relations, and making clear that Beijing and Beijing alone will set the terms for engagement. Given that reality, and given that COVID-19 has now pushed our current circumstances into a period of perhaps sustained flux, think it's worth considering what challenges may lay ahead for Taiwan's security. And I see four possible hazardous scenarios, which I've written about for GTI previously. So first, I think there's the possibility of an abortive recovery in China. China has slowly reopened, but if there is a second outbreak, and one that plunges China back into the nearly nationwide lockdown we saw earlier this year, Xi Jinping might well face greater challenges than during the first quarter of the year here. Whether that means a challenge to his leadership from within the Chinese Communist Party, or perhaps real concerns about the trajectory of public anger in China, Xi could well be tempted to take action that would both divert attention externally and unify the party. And with the United States distracted and at least momentarily weakened due to the pandemic, Taiwan might well look like an appetizing target. In a second scenario that I've outlined, China's recovery from the virus may well be lasting, but an economic rebound fails to materialize. Perhaps Chinese consumers don't start consuming again, and even if they do, the Chinese economy is now facing weakened global demand. And if China's major trading partners, including the United States, fail to really get a grip on COVID-19, weakened demand for exports could stretch from a period of weeks to a few months or longer. I think an arrested economic recovery would complicate Xi's efforts to fulfill his promise of greater prosperity for all. I think it's worth remembering that 2020, this year, was supposed to be the year by which the CCP was to have completed its task of transforming China into what the CCP calls a moderately prosperous society. And so, as in the first scenario I outlined, Xi Jinping may well find that he has ample reason to employ the PLA against Taiwan. In the third scenario, I think opportunism rather than desperation could drive Xi Jinping to move against Taiwan. Again, with the United States and all of its allies essentially focused internally due to viral outbreaks, China's leaders may wonder if America's ability, readiness, and willingness to come to Taiwan's aid are presently diminished, and perhaps only temporarily. Might Xi manufacture a crisis over the Taiwan Strait to test US responses? Now, Xi may think that he can control escalation in the event that the United States, or Taiwan for that matter, reacts strongly, but he may be wrong. And finally, I think there's a longer term scenario to consider. Here in the United States, COVID-19 has necessitated economic stabilization efforts at a cost of, I think, nearly $3 trillion and counting now. There are going to be budgetary consequences going forward. So even if the United States succeeds in containing the spread of the virus and mitigating its economic effects to some extent in the short term, I think Washington's longer term ability to effectively wage strategic competition with China will face constraints, because I think we're going to see constraints on the defense budget going forward. So even if the near term or potential hazards I've outlined don't come to pass, I think there's the risk that the coronavirus will leave the United States internally focused to an extent not seen in decades, or with far less wherewithal to shape the security environment in regions distant from American shores. And if that's the case, annexing Taiwan will increasingly look feasible to the PLA. And I'll stop there. Thanks, Russell.
Mike, thank you very much for that very sobering assessment. I think you laid out some very informative parameters for how different scenarios may play out during and post the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think you raise a even bigger question in your final point with regards to the constraints on strategic competition, on the U.S. ability to wage strategic competition in this post-pandemic environment. And I would like to pose that as a question, actually, maybe to kick things off to Lang He, about whether or not in this post-pandemic situation, whether you find that indeed, what are the how would that impact the United States' ability to engage in strategic competition with China?
Well, clearly the pandemic situation is affecting how the administration views the U.S.-China relationship. it is affecting its view of a lot of different things with respect to the relationship with the entire region. I guess what I would say is that we're going through an unprecedented time in terms of economic contraction here in the U.S. We're going through an unprecedented amount of I would say, sort of internal challenge. You know, our very structure of governance in terms of the federalist system that the U.S. is built on, the response to the coronavirus in terms of differences between how states are pursuing it, how localities are pursuing it, how the federal government's pursuing it. Those create challenges, institutional challenges for our system that I don't think I would necessarily say would inhibit our forward-looking ability to deal with challenges that might be raised, for example, by Beijing. What I do worry about a little bit is the political cycle, which, as everyone who watches this will note, you know, we have a presidential election here in the United States coming up in November. It's notoriously difficult to get anything done during a presidential election year, whether in foreign or domestic policy. Having had a considerable amount of experience in the political arena, I can just tell you that you know, we should temper our expectations for significant activity of any kind this year. What I would just say is my concern is that the issues might get a little overheated because of what we're seeing in the presidential election cycle here. The degree to which, for example, the relationship of the U.S. with the PRC becomes a campaign issue, which I think every signal that we've seen from certainly the president's campaign suggests that's going to be an issue that they would like to raise. Those kinds of things, you know, when the conversation gets a little bit hot, it does make it harder, I think, for there to be progress made on underlying issues. So my broader concern is not with you know, the extent to which the country is challenged by the response from this and what happens after the peak of the pandemic has passed as we get into the summer and fall. It's more my concern about how a presidential campaign year and the natural rhythms of that might interfere with our ability to really credibly and sort of in a level-headed way address some of the challenges that surely will be raised in the U.S.-China relationship, as well as the cross-Strait situation that Mike alluded to in his remarks.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Langy. You know, I think moving back to the focus of our panel today, I think, you know, it's unfortunate again that the Deputy Assistant Secretary is unable to join us due to scheduling difficulties. But to the issue of how the United States and Taiwan are cooperating to combat COVID-19, I should note that, you know, the United States and Taiwan had held a virtual forum on March 31st, which, according to the State Department's readout, had focused on, quote, creating forums to share the successful and internationally lauded Taiwan model on fighting COVID-19 with countries around the world. And originally, I'd wanted to ask this to Das, but perhaps maybe, you know, Vincent, you could share with us a little bit more about, you know, really what is this Taiwan model and how are the United States and Taiwan cooperating in this regard to really combat COVID-19?
Thanks, Russell. That's a great question, actually. And, you know, there's a lot of different iterations of the Taiwan model. So I'm not going to try to claim that I speak on behalf of what the Taiwan model is and isn't. I've heard a lot of T's being thrown around. I think there's a document out there with 5 T's as part of the Taiwan model. But, you know, let me focus at least on my view of it, which is probably 3 of those T's. The first one is transparency. And as you know, during this virus, I think we had a whole of government approach that really emphasized the importance of transparency, because we knew that to effectively combat COVID-19, it would need a whole society effort. It couldn't just be a government-led effort. It couldn't just be an effort led by our healthcare professionals. You know, there would need to be a lot of buy-in from the public, and we gradually saw that as well. You know, if you go into a restaurant in Taipei right now, the first thing you do is not order from a menu, or even be handed a menu, is you get your temperature checked. So, like, this small business owners, people, you know, that do deliveries all across society, there's a high degree of consciousness, and to achieve that, we really needed transparency, and that's what we endeavored to do from day one. So we've held daily press conferences. We've established, hotlines that people can phone in and get information on and report symptoms. We've even developed apps to not only track where, critical medical supplies were and where you could buy them, but also, for example, to provide critical health information. We've given very frequent public service announcements. There's a long list of efforts we're engaged in. How we're sharing that with the U.S. So we've had discussions in this regard. The most recent, as you know, was that GCTF that we held just yesterday, and that focused really on combating disinformation, which is really a critical part of transparency. But that's just really one example of the broad array of discussions I think that we've had on issues like this on transparency. The second,
oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
The second part is technology. And I'm not going to go into all of them because there's a long list, but it's widely out there on the internet. Some of the technological tools we've employed in terms of combating coronavirus, everything, from digital fences to smart monitoring systems to these forms that people have to fill out before they can enter Taiwan. So there's a wide range of technological tools, and I think Audrey Tang again has done a really good job of explaining and sharing some of these tools with audiences here in the U.S. The third part I would say is teamwork. And we're seeing this all across the world, but especially in Taiwan, there's a whole society part, but there's also a whole government approach. And none of the foreign ministry couldn't do this by itself. The health ministry can't. It really required people to sit down together and discuss what can the government do about this rather than individual ministries. And so that's exactly what the task force that we have is, the Central Epidemic Control Center. It's really to coordinate a whole of government response and to make sure that people are working together with one another. So again, T's. I've mentioned 3 T's. I think there's other T's out there. But the important thing is that this is a model that's, I think, applicable for democratic countries. It's a model that has shown that has worked in the democratic country. And this is why we feel it's important to share this. And this is what we're doing, sharing it here in the States, but also share it with other countries around the world and hopefully with the WHO as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Vincent. And one of the points that you mentioned disinformation. The Deputy Foreign Minister had also mentioned disinformation in his opening statement. The United States has been a target of China's disinformation in regards to COVID-19. One of the ways is that, in which China has responded is to try to spread disinformation to try to obfuscate the origins of the virus. And can you describe some of the way what you are seeing in terms of the disinformation that Taiwan is facing from China in regards to COVID-19?
So obviously societies are particularly susceptible to disinformation because I think there's a lot of anxiety within society at times like this. So people are prone to, I think, believe what is being spread to them by family members or friends. So we're seeing that in terms of a lot of the disinformation on the coronavirus itself, on for example, what people should and should not do in response to the coronavirus. A lot of this erroneous information does have origins that have come from across the Taiwan Strait. We have teams that have been tracking this issue. So there's a domestic component to it, but more broadly speaking, there's also international component to it. And we've seen this manifest itself in different ways. The most prominent way we've seen this manifest itself is really in terms of our relationship with Dr. Tedros from the WHO. And, Dr. Tedros has been quite public about accusing Taiwan of fermenting racism. I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to deny that there were a lot of heated comments that were posted by Taiwanese citizens on Dr. Tedros' Facebook. But I think, to accuse the government of really fermenting this or turning a blind eye on this, I think that's absolutely, it could not be further from the truth. We have released public statements saying that we should express views rationally, that people should not get emotional about this. And of course, we cannot, condone racism any stronger. Like, racism has no place in a democratic society in Taiwan. But, with this being said, we have found evidence that some of the more coordinated aspects of what we're seeing in terms of these personal attacks, there are evidence that this has come from across the strait, that there has been Umao in terms of China's internet netizens involved in some of this. The most clear-cut evidence we have so far is after Dr. Tedros came public and accused Taiwan of this racism, we saw a brigade of people go on Dr. Tedros's Facebook to really accept responsibility, claim responsibility, saying they're from Taiwan and they apologize for this taking place and that they feel horrible about it. And we had our criminal investigation bureau take a deep dive and deep look at where these comments are coming from, and we found, really strong evidence that this was a coordinated campaign from across the Taiwan Strait, and that these Chinese netizens were taking really coordinated orders to do things like this. So again, there's a lot of parts of it. There's a domestic part, there's international part. I think the theme tying it together is that there is an interest from China, a vested interest in trying to sow discord and disharmony within Taiwan, in trying to impair Taiwan's relations with the rest of the world, the WHO in particular. They have a vested interest in this. We obviously don't. And so we're seeing the results of that.
Thanks for that. Now, Leahy, if I could return back to you and to one of the original questions that I had posed to you after your comment, and that is, again, to broaden our discussion a bit about global governance. Again, it's quite remarkable, unbelievable, really, that the PRC was appointed to a seat on the UN Human Rights Council. And again, these are, and they will play a key role in basically selecting human rights investigators. That means, the rights to, these are investigators who will monitor the freedom of speech, health, enforce disappearances and arbitrary detention. Can you speak to briefly about what this larger issue of global governance and what you think, the Trump administration is doing and should do about it? I think some have reasonably argued that maybe a better way to fix these institutions and participate in global governance is to stay within it and fix it from within. How do you respond to that?
Well, let me just say that there's a few factors that we have to bear in mind. First of all, the U.S. for many, many years has neglected what has been going on inside of a number of international organizations. Some of that is benign, actually pretty much all of it, I would argue, is benign neglect. But it is certainly the case that if you look at multinational organizations, we've talked about the WHO, you had mentioned earlier ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Global Intellectual Property Protection Group. There's any number of different, you mentioned the UNHCR, there's any number of different entities where the United States has not played a particularly active role in helping to determine or steer where the leadership of those organizations has gone. It is also the case that during the same period of time, the PRC has been very active in trying to determine the leadership of these organizations. Their influence, for example, over the election of Dr. Tedros to lead the WHO is well documented. The degree to which they engaged in pressure campaigns on member countries to vote for their preferred candidate, not just with respect to the WHO, but other global organizations as well. And so the way that the PRC has sought influence in these organizations has a lot less to do with its financial contributions directly. In fact, if you look at the financial contributions from the PRC into the WHO, the actual contributions pale in comparison to what the US has given over these many years, in some cases by a factor of almost 10. So it's not a financial contribution strategy. It's a strategy premised on influence in the bureaucratic inside game, if you will. And I think there Beijing has been very effective. And it is also the case that the United States has not really paid much attention, has not really cared very much until very recently. And here again, I think the Trump administration deserves credit for naming a special envoy at the State Department reporting directly to Secretary Pompeo, whose sole goal is to root out malign influence in international organizations from state actors like China, who seek to influence those organizations, not for the furtherance of goals related to the organizations themselves. So, for example, the goal isn't necessarily to make the WHO a better public health organization, but situations where China is really seeking to advance its political and or other agendas via leadership in those international organizations. And so I think the U.S. has been much more keen in certainly the recent months to identify situations. And in fact, we've already begun doing so. There was a recent election in a multilateral organization relating to global copyright issues, I believe, where the U.S.'s preferred candidate was able to triumph over a candidate backed by the PRC. So this kind of activity, where the U.S. is more concerned with what's happening in these multilateral organizations and the degree to which the PRC has managed to advance its agenda via these organizations, I think is a very welcome development. And I think is something that, regardless of what happens in this November's election, ought to continue in the next presidential administration here in the U.S.
I think something related, and thanks, I think something related to the broader question of international institutions, and this is to bring the discussion to Taiwan here. And I'd like to pose this question to Mike, and maybe Lang-Hee, you can comment as well if you like. But Congress and the White House recently passed, and the president signed the Taipei Act. And I think for the audience, it stands for Taiwan Allies International Protection and Enhancement Initiative Act of 2019, which, among other things, advises the executive branch to support Taiwan's participation in international organizations, as well as encouraging the executive branch to evaluate its diplomatic posture, economic and political, otherwise, vis-a-vis other countries, with consideration of their relations with Taiwan. Would you two be able to comment a bit about what you think the implications of the Taipei Act will have with regards to U.S. support for Taiwan's ability to participate in international organizations, as well as to maintain, if not maybe enhance its ability to maintain and improve its diplomatic standing with its existing diplomatic partners, and those that it does not have diplomatic relations with. Mike, you want to start?
Sure, Russell. Thanks. So, I think on the supporting Taiwan's participation in IOs, I think the bill probably doesn't have a huge impact. I mean, this is something that the United States has been doing for years. I think it's important that there's a symbolic importance to Congress putting this down in law and the U.S. president signing it. Right? It signals that this is a priority. Hopefully, due to experiences over the last few months, the United States begins to consider Taiwan's exclusion from the WHO and other important international organizations as really a national security concern for the United States. And if we do so, that should lead us to put more personnel, more resources behind efforts to ensure Taiwan's meaningful, practical participation going forward. To me, the diplomatic allies piece to this legislation is much more interesting. There's some debate over whether punishing small countries that switch their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, whether that sort of punishment is ultimately counterproductive, because it gives China an opportunity to extend its influence even further in these smaller countries. Honestly, I don't know where I fall on the issue. I think there's something to be said for, I think, as Russell, you said to me once, killing the chicken to scare the monkey, right? That punishing one of these countries makes it far less likely that other countries will follow suit. But hopefully we don't have to get to that point. Again, there is now, Congress has put into law, the United States president has signed into law a bill which indicates the United States has a deep and profound interest in Taiwan maintaining the diplomatic allies it has. I think it's clear that every time one of Taiwan's diplomatic allies abandons that relationship, that represents a change in the cross-strait status quo, one pushed by China. That's a national security concern for the United States. And again, if this leads to us putting more personnel, more resources into helping Taiwan shore up those relationships, I think that's a positive thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it strikes me that, with your point about the limitations on the bill's ability to really impact Taiwan's ability to join international organization, just reminded me of the degree to which China's influence is exerted on a lot of international institutions to very almost in serious but almost laughable ways. And I'm reminded about Lang He brought this up, and I mentioned it, the Civil Aviation Organization. And Mike, I know in your case, you've had a bit of a run-in with the ICAO's Twitter management system when you were apparently blocked among many other, several other people on their social media account for tweeting about Taiwan's exclusion from the International Civil Aviation Organization, and that was really unbelievable. Really on that point, So it just again, I think it just highlights the scale to which China's footprint weighs on even the social media accounts of these international institutions, and this is not to make light, of course, of the importance of Taiwan's meaningful participation in these organizations, because there are really important ways that Taiwan can contribute. Vincent, maybe if I could return to you, we have a few more minutes before I'm going to open up to Q&A, and we've gotten a good list of questions from the audience, and so I'll turn to that. But I do want to sort of turn to you here with to get your comments on really in how Taiwan can contribute to global governance in other in other ways other than health. And I was wondering, maybe you can speak to the issues of civil aviation and law enforcement issues and others that you may that you think are important to highlight here with regards to Taiwan's ability to participate in some of these international organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. I mean, that's a very big area, and obviously we've kept the focus on WHO in the past couple of weeks because, number one, it's coming up quite fast, and number two, we felt that we've had the strongest case for the WHO because really it's a matter of global health, and you don't play politics with global health, and Taiwan is a recognized leader in global health and so on. So there's obviously a strong case to be made for all international organizations, but the WHO really in particular, which is why we've seen so much of a focus on it. In terms of ICAO is another focus of ours, and it's really a two-way street, right? On one hand, it's really important for the people of Taiwan, for our airlines and for our air traffic, experts and so forth, to get information they need from ICAO, in terms of regulatory information, in terms of information connections with other countries, making sure that, we have a common platform to discuss issues, such as when China does place a flight path right at the center of the Taiwan Strait, potentially endangering both their own planes, but also our own planes as well. So, there's obviously a lot of value in for Taiwan from ICAO, but on the flip side of that, there's also a lot of value ICAO can get from Taiwan as well. Not only because we are situated in a very, very important part of the world. Our air defense identification zone actually encompasses a lot of traffic in Northeast Asia. And so there's a lot we can share with ICAO, both on a technical level, but also on a broader regulatory level. So again, on ICAO, it's really a two-way street, but that also applies for Interpol as well. We've seen cases, like real life cases that have been played in Taiwan media about how Taiwan's exclusion from Interpol has created legal loopholes within our part of the world. When you have essentially fugitives that are wanted by Interpol being able to board a plane to Taiwan, and nobody in Taiwan being knowledgeable about this until they land, and then they commit crimes in Taiwan, and we don't have that sort of mechanism or institutional framework to trade information on it. And it harms us, obviously, but it also harms Interpol. Because think about where these criminals, fugitives go next, right? They go to other countries. And so on all of these issues, it's really a two-way street. So I think that, but let me put it this way. Health, we have a very strong case, both on the governance side, both because we are a recognized leader here, but on other international organizations. And it's not just ICAO, it's not just Interpol, it's UNFCCC, it's many, many other organizations. Taiwan has a role to play the same as every other member of the global community. And the reason why they don't exclude other members of the global community, because they recognize each country has a role to play, and Taiwan has that same role to play. So that's on that issue. Russell, if I could just spend 1 minute talking about this slightly different issue on the WHO.
Sure.
I've realized just recently, and it's always struck me as really weird recently, because we keep hearing Taiwan coming from the WHO. This used to never take place. They really bent over backwards to try to figure out all these creative euphemisms and never mention Taiwan, but at the same time refer to Taiwan. And all of a sudden, you have the DG, you have all these officials saying that, we do work with Taiwan. Taiwan is a recognized partner, blah, 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 blah. And they say this because they know Taiwan can only be recognized when people use the correct word, which is Taiwan. But at the same time, they make these comments. If you go look at all these health databases, if you look at the coronavirus map that they have, none of it mentions Taiwan. They say Taipei and environs. They say Taiwan province of China. They say all of this. So it's really weird. It's like the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. And I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's worth discussing how WHO officials all of a sudden see a lot of value in saying, in stating Taiwan for what it is. But at the same time, when it comes to, giving health information, giving information about international statistics to these health experts, they find it convenient and they find it necessary to not mention Taiwan. So anyways, just want to put that out there.
Yeah. Lanhee and Mike, do you guys have any comments before I move to the audience questions? Perhaps to respond to what Vincent said, or maybe some additional points that you wanted to make?
Look, I think Vincent's hit on a very important point, which is that nomenclature has always been extremely and exceedingly important to international organizations, and the WHO has been an example of that. There was a well-documented set of instances when Margaret Chan was DG of the WHO. She ordered that the WHO refer to Taiwan as Taiwan province of China. That was sort of a well-known desire to use nomenclature to slight Taiwan's role in the international community. But it is noteworthy that the WHO is now seeking at every instance to essentially protect its own reputation by arguing that it's been more engaged with Taiwan than the reality of the situation tells us. And the nomenclature argument is just part of the way in which the WHO has sought to essentially have its cake and eat it too.
Yeah. Okay. Mike, do you have any?
The only thing I'd add is I think as we look to seek to secure more participation for Taiwan in international organizations, and again, I think Lanhee has pointed to ways to do this. Both and just engaging more directly in these organizations, trying to avoid the benign neglect of past years. Perhaps doing some of the horse trading that we know China does with voting members. That's a game that we need to start playing again. I think we can also think creatively about some shorter term solutions. So, for example, would the State Department consider inviting diplomats from Taiwan's foreign ministry to set up shop in the Bureau for International Organization Affairs? Again, it's not a perfect solution. It doesn't get Taiwan to where it wants to be and where we want to see Taiwan go. But does that assist Taiwan in raising its profile and getting quicker, more direct access to the sorts of information it wants from these organizations? We want to aim for the long-term goal of meaningful participation, but there may be some shorter-term things that the United States can do that nobody else can really object to help move us in that direction.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mike. So now moving on to audience questions. We have an excellent list of questions. And the first question is from Tina Chung, who is a journalist with the Voice of America. Her question is, Beijing is threatening to cut medical supplies to the Netherlands. whose office in Taipei just changed its name this week to, I think, Netherlands office in Taipei in English. What is Beijing's purpose in doing this, and what should the U.S. and global response be? Perhaps maybe Mike or Lang He, you want to take this question?
Sure. I mean, look, it just demonstrates how thin-skinned, China's foreign ministry is. This name change is not all that significant. It shouldn't be looked at as significant. It includes the word of a city in Taiwan in the title now. It doesn't reference the word, it doesn't use the word Taiwan, it doesn't use the word Republic of China, it doesn't use the word embassy or consulate. So first of all, it demonstrates once again how ridiculous Chinese diplomats can be. And secondly, I think the decision to make a stink over this points to the point that I made in my original comments, which is China has made a decision of no compromise right now with Taiwan and on Taiwan issues. It does not want to give an inch when it comes to Taiwan's engagement in the international community, whether that be with international organizations or with diplomatic partners, formal and informal. I think the best thing to do in these situations is to point out the ridiculousness of the position. For the United States to lend its moral support to the Netherlands, it's a NATO ally, and financial support if necessary to send medical supplies if China acts on its threat to withhold them. It simply work to take the sting out of these threats so that other countries feel more confident in making similar changes if that's something that they want to do.
Thanks for that. Okay. Next question we have from Ariel Chang from Sibley Line Americas, analyst there. Despite how unjust the WHO has been doing, is cutting fund right now the right move? Should the U.S. consider taking stronger measures after COVID-19 if we can ever put this disease behind us? I think, Lang, you addressed this question earlier, perhaps maybe if you wanted to sort of address specifically what the
it's a fair question. I think there's a couple of points to make here. First of all, if you look at the WHO budget, a very, very small percentage, in fact, by some calculations, as little as 2% of the WHO's budget, in particular, the U.S. contribution to the WHO's budget is earmarked for pandemic response. Okay. So not to say that that's not an important amount of money, but my point simply is that a lot of times in the media, there can be a sensationalization around what the impacts of U.S. policy changes might look like. To provide some context, it is the case the U.S. is the world's largest donor to the WHO. The world's second largest donor to the WHO is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives over $300 million a year to the WHO. Mr. Gates has generously decided that he wants to expend a little bit more of his personal capital to support the WHO. And my point would be that if you look at the amount of money we're talking about, at least with respect to the current pandemic, that amount of money is relatively small. But there's a broader point here beyond just the dollars and cents of it. And that is, when is the United States going to be in a better position to seek reform of an organization that is desperately in need of it? Should we wait until the next pandemic? Should we wait until the next global crisis? Or should we try and effectuate change when we have the opportunity to effectuate that change? So I think the administration's policy of trying to seek investigations, not even saying, look, we're going to fundamentally change the organization, just say, let's figure out what's gone on. Let's figure out where the process failures have been. I'd argue the right time to start that process is not a year from now, it's now. Because a year from now, we're going to face a different global exigency. We're going to face a different global situation. And this is the time for the U.S. to press ahead and take the bold leadership position that that the president's taken, that the administration's taken. So I do think that we have to be careful about simply waiting to do things when we have the opportunity to do them now. And I think the U.S. saying, "Hey, look, we're gonna pause." No one said we're gonna cut funding to the WHO permanently. As far as I understand it, the president's not even saying that the current year allocation of the WHO is going to be completely withheld. He's saying, let's hang on. Let's give ourselves 60 to 90 days to come up with some policy options to figure out how to address the WHO's response. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach.
Okay. All right.
Hey, Russell, could I just chime in
Sure.
a tiny bit on this issue? If the WHO is so concerned about funding and money, then they shouldn't have turned down a donation that Taiwan made concerning the Ebola crisis. There was a public call for a donation drive on behalf of the WHO to try to acquire, funding support for the Ebola crisis that was taking place at the time. Taiwan immediately came up and said we would donate $1 million. To this date, the WHO has refused to take that money from us. So if they're really so concerned about this money and they're so concerned about funding, maybe they should stop, refusing some of the generous offers that they've been receiving from Taiwan.
Good point. Next question is from Jonathan Wolfish with Legislative Strategies. Now, should the U.S. condition future financial contributions to the WHO by demanding that Taiwan be allowed to participate in the WHO and WHA? Anyone want to take this?
I'll take it, Russell. My answer to that would be no. Look, as badly as the WHO has handled this crisis in some ways, again, as Lanny has discussed, it does serve a critical role, and it's had important successes in the past. Is it an organization in need of reform? Yes. Is it an organization that would benefit immensely from Taiwan's participation? Yes. I don't think we want to take steps which could meaningfully weaken it over the longer term. Besides which, I think that that's not the right way to get towards Taiwan's participation. Again, the right way, in my mind, to do that is not to target the organization directly, but to target the members of the World Health Assembly, which vote on issues concerning Taiwan's participation or lack thereof. Again, this means bilateral diplomacy in many cases, making threats, making promises, in order to ensure that the members that make up the WHO are increasingly supportive of Taiwan's participation. I think that's how we get to where we want to go, and not by targeting the organization directly.
I see that you unmuted yourself. So
I agree with a lot of what Mike has said. I think the end goal here is to effectuate Taiwan's participation in the WHO. It's not necessarily to think about what a politically appealing strategy might be in the short run, at least with respect to this specific question. I think there's a lot to be said for working together with like-minded countries to say, what can we do to ensure that the participation of Taiwan and contributing its understanding and its expertise, and also reflecting back to work with Taiwan to deal with situations where it is going to be on the front lines of global public health crises. I think those are the right questions to be asking, and effectuating their participation. My sense is premising funding on that would only serve to backfire, I think, in the current setting. So while I am all for pressing ahead with the effort to include Taiwan as part of the World Health Assembly proceedings, I think the U.S. should be judicious about how it plays those cards.
Okay. Thanks. Next question is from Rita Jen, who is a journalist with the Radio Free Asia. Question is, will Taiwan consider similar approach or join the U.S. action, for instance, suing the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, an International Court of Justice, or using the current cross-strait judicial mutual assistance agreement? I think this question is for you, Vincent.
I wish I could answer that, but I can't. I think it's a question better directed to the Mainland Affairs Council and our Ministry of Justice. But I think you have to look at the legal mechanisms for that and whether those mechanisms exist. Again, I'm not in a position to answer that simply because it's not within our purview. But I think again, it's worth exploring whether those legal mechanisms exist in Taiwan, and I suspect that you'll find that those mechanisms do not exist.
And well, the journalist has another question, and this one's for Michael and Langy, and so maybe you might have the two of you might have some comments on this. It's another legal question. This is in terms of sovereign immunity, how possible will it be going to work? Will it be to sue the Chinese government in the U.S. and abroad on in criminal or civil cases?
My read on this, and Mike might have a different opinion or the same one, is that it's going to be a challenge to do it without an act of Congress. This is not an area of law that I spend a lot of time thinking about or dwelling on, so I only know what's been reported and what's been discussed. But my sense is that it's going to be tough to do, again, without Congress acting, and even then, I think it could be a challenge.
Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, look, I guess I would add two things. One, I think sovereign immunity is a principle which is of immense importance to the United States, and I think we wanted to be very careful in how we approach perhaps getting around it when it comes to other countries. We want to be careful with the precedents we're setting, but perhaps more importantly, I think that there are other ways to ensure that we hold China accountable, which the United States and its allies and partners have more control over. So even if we could sue the Chinese Communist Party or the government of China, and even if those lawsuits were decided against China, China's never going to pay that money. So there is no restitution that actually will occur. What steps can we take to actually impose costs on China to ensure that it's held accountable? One idea would be to launch a serious effort to cancel the Beijing Olympics in 2022, or to move them elsewhere. Right? That's something which would require diplomacy rather than an act of the courts. And again, is obviously China will put up a fight, but it's something that's more within control of the administration rather than the court system here or the international courts. I think there are other ways to go about this problem as well, which again are potentially effective in holding China to account.
Thanks for the measured responses. For the final question from the audience, I'll take the question from Garrett Vanderwees, who is an advisor at GTI. His question is, if we want to change the WHO, we need broad support, in particular from our European allies, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. How can we specifically get our European allies to be more supportive of Taiwan into the WHO? Question mark. Langhee or Michael, Vincent, all of you, invite all of you to comment.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, this is a difficult one. We've already seen, for example, the Australian situation. Scott Morrison, has been very supportive of President Trump in seeking an independent investigation of the WHO's actions in this case, talking about need for reform of the WHO. And then in response, obviously, the foreign ministry in China and the PRC has threatened a lot of things and made it a challenge, which has caused Australia to have to step back a little bit from its leadership position. So this is a difficult one. I would simply say that it is incumbent on the United States to rally support for institutional reform up to and including inclusion of Taiwan in some capacity in the World Health Organization. It is about trying to gather together those countries who are like-minded and who value the same kinds of principles of transparency and accountability and the free exchange of ideas that the United States does. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to work specifically unless we are willing to step up to the plate and respond and react and deal with our European partners, for example, in a way that might take the sting, as Mike was saying earlier, out of whatever diplomatic or other action the PRC might take against those countries in response.
Mike, do you have something to add?
Sure. Look, I would just say that at this moment in time, and it may not last, but at this moment in time, Beijing is doing the heavy lifting for us, right? So we've seen the failure, certainly in the initial Chinese response to the outbreak in Wuhan. We've seen the way that the WHO has handled this over the past few months. And we've, again, as I pointed out in my opening remarks, we've all seen the way Taiwan has handled this. And so I don't think there's ever been a clearer case been made about the value of having Taiwan engaged with the WHO. And it's a case the United States had no part in making. So we need to take advantage of this opportunity to amplify that case, right? And agree with everything Lanhee said. To make sure that when we do see countries like Australia, and we've seen other people pop up their heads in Europe now calling for stronger bilateral ties with Taiwan in their countries, that we are vocal and quick in supporting those initiatives. We don't want to let this opportunity pass us by.
Vincent, do you have anything to add in terms of Taiwan's engagement with Europe, and in terms of generating more support for Taiwan's participation in the WHO?
Sure. I tend to think about it like this. I mean, from the outset, I agree with everything Lanhee and Michael said in regards to this question, but I also tend to think about support for Taiwan in the WHO and the like-minded countries that do that as a sort of a club, a pro-Taiwan in the WHO club. And one way to grow that club is to really build momentum, to show people that it's the right place to be. You build a case for people to join in that club. And then as that club grows bigger and bigger, it becomes much, much easier to keep recruiting people. So from a foreign policy perspective, I think the key point is to be really targeted at this point in terms of European countries that we have a good relationship with, countries that you see eye to eye with us, with the United States in terms of values, in terms of value for Taiwan being in WHO. And so you start, really in a focused way, making a case to these countries of Taiwan being in WHO and bringing them into that club. And once that club grows, it becomes easier to recruit more and more European countries to be a part of that club. So I don't think we're at the end phase yet. I don't even think we're really at the mid phase yet. We're really, at the start of the process where we're building up that club. But I think that as time goes by, this club will become easier and easier to recruit people for this club amongst European countries. And that's going to really make a difference in terms of Taiwan's bid to participate in the WHO.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And I think that's a perfect segue to close. And to close, I would like to quote the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Robert Destro, who stated at the Global Cooperation and Training Framework Forum that was jointly held by the United States, Taiwan, and Japan earlier this week, that both the Deputy Foreign Minister and Vincent have referenced, that, quote, "All of us are learning from the Taiwan model, a fact that underscores that democracies have the clear upper hand over authoritarian regimes when it comes to fighting this virus. If the rest of the world would follow the Taiwan model, including the transparency and timely communications needed to fight disinformation, all of us would be better positioned in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic, which is by no means over, and to work together to repair the damage to our communities and businesses," end quote. Thank you all to our viewers, as well as, of course, our panelists for joining today's panel. And we look forward to seeing all of you at our next event. Thank you, take care, and stay healthy.